Nope.
You really don't know what you have until it's gone. I'll premise this story with some information about my living situation. I'm a single female, working professional, living on my own in Southern California. I've been in the apartment I currently live in for about 2 years. I lived in a different apartment a year before that. Throughout those 3 years, I've been followed by something I can't explain. I constantly notice weird things happening. Sounds, things moving around on their own, and on really bad nights, unexplainable bruises on my arms and legs. These experiences are so prevalent that I can honestly say I'm not even scared anymore, for the most part. I've even given this entity a nickname, Apartment Ghost. Cut me some slack on the creativity, I'm a left-brain person. We can call it Apt G for short. Now that you have an understanding of my unique situation, we can proceed with the events of this story. About a month ago, I went to Chicago to visit some family and friends. I was staying with my cousin, who owns a home in the suburbs. This cousin of mine, let's call him John, has 3 young kids. Willie, age 5, Chris, age 3, and Danny, age 1. These kids are amazing, well-behaved, respectful, smart, and pretty funny for being so young. Willie is extremely outgoing. Danny is the princess of the house, naturally. And Chris, well, Chris has the traits you'd expect from a middle child. He's quiet, kind of shy, and mostly does his own thing. Oh, and he's my favorite. Things were normal for the first few nights I stayed in the house. It wasn't until the 3rd night that something strange happened. It was about 11 p.m., and I was sitting with my cousin John and his wife. We were having some drinks, shooting the shit, and just hanging out in the family room. We all paused and looked at each other when we heard the front door lock click to unlock. We sort of just sat there, frozen, looking and feeling more confused than we were scared. That is until the front door actually began to creak open, before slamming shut with a loud thud. John sprang into action and ran to the door to check things out. All seemed normal. There was no sign of anybody coming in. If someone had entered, there's no way they would have gotten away quick enough to not be detected. Regardless, we all went ahead and searched every inch of the house. None of us found anything. The kids were still asleep in their rooms. As cliche as this may be, we ended up blaming the weather. It was winter in Chicago after all. John figured he hadn't completely shut the door, and that a powerful gust of wind did the rest. Things continued to be normal for the next day. I had left John's house early in the morning, heading off to stay with a different relative who was closer to the city. I would only be there for a night or 2 before returning to the suburbs, so I gave John a call in order to figure things out. That's when he mentioned something about his son, Chris. Yeah, it's the weirdest thing. The morning you left, Chris came into our room crying. He said he was having a nightmare about a scary dark man watching him sleep. I raised an eyebrow. Oh? Does he usually have nightmares? No, that's the weird part. This is the first time he's mentioned having them, John replied. But I guess it was bound to happen at some point. I sort of shrugged it off at first. Kids have nightmares all the time. I went about my day, visiting friends and exploring the city. Eventually, the time came to return to the suburbs. I arrived at John's, and was immediately greeted by his children with big hugs. Willie took charge, dragging me by the hand to show me his latest school project. As I followed him, I noticed Chris go and sit down by himself, playing with his action figures. He usually stuck by his brother's side from what I saw. Again, I shrugged it off and followed Willie. When he was done showing off his project, I walked over and sat on the ground next to Chris. "Hey bud, how are you?" Chris looked up at me and forced a smile. I noticed he looked exhausted, with small bags under his formerly bright eyes. He whimpered back, "I'm a little tired, I guess." "What's the matter? Couldn't sleep last night?" He stopped playing with his toys and began to stare at the floor. Without looking up at me, he whispered, He won't let me sleep." I was taken aback. Who could he be talking about? Willie? His dad? Why wouldn't they let him sleep? "Who won't let you sleep, Chris?" That's when he looked up at me for a moment. His tired eyes were now filled with a combination of fear and concern. "Your friend from California." I immediately felt chills run down my spine. He couldn't possibly be referring to what I thought he was, could he? "Chris, who are you?" Before I could finish my sentence, Chris's head jerked back up from his toys. He was now facing my direction, eyes wide and mouth slightly agape. I noticed after a second that though he was staring near me, he wasn't actually staring at me. He was staring just barely above my shoulder. Remembering the look of absolute terror he had on his face still gives me goosebumps. After a moment, he slowly turned his gaze to meet mine. It was as if he was pleading with me for help. I didn't see whatever he was looking at. I didn't dare turn my head, even in the slightest. All I could think to do was wrap him in my arms and hug him tight. He buried his face in my torso, and I can feel his small frame shaking frantically. I felt horrible. Had I done this? Did I say something in passing about apartment ghost that he may have overheard? I couldn't make sense of any of it. Just then, John came and told us that dinner was ready. He looked down at us with confusion. Everything all right, you two?" I quickly spoke up. "Yeah, all good. Chris is just feeling a bit tired is all." "I bet he is. Little guy has barely slept since you left." I forced a fake smile and nodded. John repeated to us that dinner was ready and that we should go ahead and get cleaned up. I picked up Chris and walked him over to the sink. He had his face in my shoulder the whole time. He calmed down a bit at dinner. I didn't mention anything to his parents. I was afraid they would think I was filling his head with horror stories. They know I have a bit of an obsession with them. That night, Chris was finally able to fall asleep. I can't say the same for myself. All night, the guest room I stayed in was filled with random noises. Clicks, taps, creaks. You name it, I heard it. I did eventually drift off and catch some sleep, but woke up feeling unrested. Eventually, the time came to say goodbye. John packed my bags into his car, ready to drive me to the airport. I hugged his wife and kids, telling them how much I'd miss them and that I'd be back soon. I hugged Chris last. Right before I pulled away, He whispered something in my ear. "Please, don't leave me alone with him." My eyes got wide and I began to tear up. I wasn't sure exactly why, but the amount of sorrow in his simple request shook me up. I stared back at him, not knowing what to say. His mom stepped in, laughing, telling him that I had to go and that he'd see me again soon. I nodded politely and walked to the door, left the house and sat in the car. As John drove off, I glanced back at the kids, who were now standing outside the door. Willie was waving goodbye, and baby Danny did the same in her mother's arms. Chris, though, was occupied with something else. He was looking up to the window of his bedroom. I looked up there too. Just as John turned a corner, I caught a glimpse of something. In Chris's window stood a dark figure. It's hard to describe, as it wasn't something I have seen before. It sort of had a human shape, but appeared to be draped in a large dark cloth or robe. I immediately burst into tears at the sight of it. John looked at me and patted me on the shoulder. "It's okay, cuz. You can come back and visit anytime." I nodded and tried my best to collect myself. Do I tell him? Do I just hope the situation deals with itself on its own? What would I even say? What would he say? Was this really my fault somehow? I decided I would keep my mouth shut. I'm a firm believer that acknowledging any type of negative entity is the first step in giving it power. I figured his ignorance was bliss, both for him and his kids. Fast forward to the other night. I got a call from John. I hadn't heard from him since returning to California, so I had put the entire incident out of my mind. Unfortunately, I had spoken too soon. John began to explain the news of his kids. "Yeah, we had to ground Willie last week." "Oh no, what did he do?" He keeps bullying his little brother." "What? That doesn't sound like him at all." "That's what we thought, but we keep finding bruises all over Chris." I thought I was going to throw up. It was still happening. And it wasn't until that moment, upon hearing him say that I realized the activity I experienced so frequently in my own apartment had completely ceased. "Bruises?" I asked with a shaky voice. "Yeah. We're pretty sure that Willie is going into his room at night and teasing him. We're finding new bruises every morning. Willie is denying it, but what else could it be?" I continued to listen, and somehow made it through the conversation. I've been thinking of Chris nonstop since then. It seems whatever that thing is that used to torment me decided to find a new victim. A new victim that wasn't so jaded and desensitized like I had become over the years. And it found one. So I guess what I'm saying is, I need help. Chris needs help. If anyone can provide insight, I would appreciate it. I just really want the ghost that haunted me to come back. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed this week's original story. If you did, be sure to destroy that like button down below, and hey, if you really enjoyed it, go ahead and subscribe for future videos if you haven't done so already. Allow me to apologize for not uploading last week. I was out of town and didn't have the means to record anything, and I also didn't plan ahead of time to have one ready, so that was my bad. And if I sound weird in this video, it's because I came down with something while I was on vacation, so I'm a little stuffed up and my throat hurts. But couldn't go 2 weeks without a video, am I right? Anyway, everybody, until next time, stay safe out there. I'll be seeing you in the next video.